quiet courthouse. A black man. A father walks in for a simple hearing. No headlines, no drama, until one arrogant deputy sees nothing but the chain around his neck and decides it doesn't belong. In a heartbeat, dignity is ripped away, shame delivered with a smirk, and the whole room stays silent. But what that deputy doesn't know is that the man he just humiliated, he's married to the judge presiding over today's courtroom. And when truth finally speaks, it won't shout. It will strike like thunder across the marble floors, leaving everyone watching and judging themselves. Stay with us. Because what you're about to witness isn't just a courtroom twist, it's a reckoning, long overdue. Marcus Holloway, a black man in his early 40s, adjusted the cuffs of his pressed navy shirt as he walked toward the heavy stone steps of the Westbridge courthouse. The early morning sun caught the dark brown of his skin, highlighting the deep lines at the corners of his eyes, lines carved by years of resilience of carrying a weight the world never cared to acknowledge. Today was supposed to be simple, a minor civil dispute, just paperwork, really. But Marcus had learned a long time ago that for a black man, nothing inside a courthouse was ever truly simple. Walking beside him was his 14-year-old son, Caleb Holloway, a wiry, sharp-eyed teenager who mirrored his father's quiet strength. Caleb wore his best polo shirt and khakis, nervous energy crackling just beneath his otherwise composed face. He wasn't supposed to miss school for this, but when Marcus asked if he wanted to come, Caleb had nodded without hesitation. Some things couldn't be learned from books. Around Marcus's neck, tucked carefully under the first button of his shirt, lay a slender gold chain, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its story. It had belonged to Marcus's father, David Holloway, a firefighter who had spent his life pulling strangers from burning buildings, only to fall victim to smoke and collapsing beams one final time. When the chain was pulled from the ashes, blackened but intact, it became the only piece of him left. Marcus never wore it for show. He wore it for grounding, for memory, for promise. As they stepped through the security scanners, Marcus caught the wary glance of one of the guards. He was used to it, the cautious once-over, the silent questioning that asked without words. "Are you where you're supposed to be?" Marcus kept his shoulders square and his pace steady. His entire life he had mastered the art of being both visible and invisible, a presence too proud to shrink, but smart enough to know when the wrong kind of attention could turn lethal. Caleb stuck close to his side, stealing glances at the high ceilings and the old portraits of stern-faced judges who lined the walls. Most of them were white, their expressions as stiff as the powdered wigs they once wore. They found a bench outside courtroom 3B and sat. Caleb swinging his legs slightly, Marcus folding his large hands together, the gold chain resting warmly against his skin like a heartbeat. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling it. The memory of his father's rough, calloused hands settling that chain around his neck the night Marcus graduated college. "You wear this when you need to remember who you are," his father had said. "Not for them, for you." Marcus breathed in deeply. Today wasn't about fighting. It was just supposed to be a simple appearance. But even as he tried to believe that a whisper of unease stirred in the pit of his stomach, the kind you learned never to ignore. Across the hall, a deputy in a pale blue uniform leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd. Marcus caught the way the man's gaze landed on him, and Caleb held just a little too long, measured just a little too much. Marcus straightened his back, offered no reaction. He'd done this dance before, but something about the stillness of the hall, the weight of the glances, and the glint of the chain under his collar told him this day might not be as simple as he had hoped. The wooden bench creaked slightly as Marcus shifted his weight, adjusting the folder on his lap. Caleb sat beside him, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve, the buzz of courthouse noise filling the background. Muted footsteps, the low murmur of lawyers conferring the occasional shuffle of paperwork. Marcus kept his eyes on the courtroom door ahead, willing himself to stay centered. He wasn't here for drama, he wasn't here for trouble, he was just a man tending to business same as anyone else. But not everyone saw it that way. Across the hallway, leaning lazily against a marble pillar, was Officer Dean Slade. A cocky smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth as he surveyed the crowd with the bored disdain of a man who thought he already knew everyone's story before hearing a single word. Marcus felt the weight of Slade's stare before he even saw it, an instinct sharpened over decades, the kind that doesn't wait for confrontation to announce itself. The chain around his neck, still tucked neatly under his shirt, seemed to heat against his skin like it sensed the shift in the air. When Marcus glanced over, he caught Slade's gaze directly. No words, just a long, slow, unapologetic once-over. And then Slade's eyes fixated not on Marcus's face, not on his posture, but on the faint glint of gold peeking just beneath his collar. Marcus held his gaze a moment longer than he should have, then turned back toward the courtroom door, saying nothing, giving nothing. Caleb noticed. The boy's hands, which had been restless moments ago, suddenly stilled on his lap. He shifted closer to his father, not saying a word, but his young face tightened with the confusion and unease he hadn't yet learned to mask. "Dad," Caleb whispered almost too low to hear. Marcus gave a subtle shake of his head. "Not now. Not here." He focused instead on his breathing, grounding himself, remembering what his father once told him. "You can't control their eyes, but you can control your dignity." Slade didn't move from his spot. He didn't have to. The message was already delivered. "I see you. I'm watching you." Every so often the deputy would shift his stance slightly, his eyes sweeping the hallway like a man patrolling a battlefield. But they always found their way back to Marcus and to the chain. There were no outward signs of aggression, no shouting, no accusations. Just a slow-burning tension so thick Marcus could almost feel it pulsing against his temples. He sat up straighter, his broad shoulders set, his hands folded neatly over the folder resting on his knees. He would not shrink. He would not engage. He had come here for one reason: to handle his case and walk out the front door with his son at his side. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that it might not be that easy. Across from him, Slade continued to loiter, thumbing the edge of his belt, tapping his boot rhythmically against the polished floor. A show of boredom, or maybe a show of power. It didn't matter which. Marcus kept his expression neutral, his body language relaxed, refusing to feed the stereotype Slade was so clearly looking to confirm. Beside him, Caleb's fingers tapped nervously against his jeans, a tiny unconscious rhythm that Marcus picked up instantly. He reached over and placed a steady hand on his son's knee, a silent reassurance. "Stay calm, stay strong." The courtroom door remained closed. The minutes dragged on. And all the while the chain rested against Marcus's chest, a simple piece of gold with a lifetime of meaning now turned into a symbol of suspicion. Under the wrong set of eyes, Marcus knew better than to react. He knew better than to invite a scene. But as he sat there, the quiet storm brewing in that marble hallway told him the day was no longer just about paperwork. Something else had begun, something heavier. And Slade, with his smirk and his easy arrogance, was just getting started. The sound of Slade's boots grew louder, each heavy step echoing against the marble walls like a slow, deliberate warning. Marcus didn't move. He just tightened his grip slightly on the folder in his lap and kept his eyes forward. But Slade wasn't the kind of man to let silence hold. "Well, well," Slade drawled as he stopped directly in front of them, arms crossed over his chest. "You look like you're dressed awful nice today." Marcus looked up, his face calm, neutral. "Just here for a court appointment," he said simply. Slade's eyes flicked again to the gold chain barely visible against Marcus's chest. He tilted his head, a mocking grin crawling across his face. "Funny thing, though," he said. "Guys like you don't usually walk around flashing things like that unless they're showing off or unless it ain't really theirs." Marcus's jaw tensed. He fought to keep his voice even. "This chain belonged to my father," he said quietly. "He earned it. I wear it to honor him." Slade chuckled, shaking his head like he'd heard a particularly dumb joke. "Sure you do," he sneered. "That's what they all say." Caleb shifted uneasily on the bench, sensing the change in the air, the way the tension wrapped tighter around his father's shoulders. Marcus held Slade's gaze for a moment longer. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "I'm just here for my hearing. That's it." But Slade wasn't interested in explanations. He leaned closer, his breath reeking of stale coffee and something bitter underneath. "You stealing from someone, that chain looks a little too real for a man like you." Caleb couldn't hold it in any longer. He jumped up, his young voice breaking through the heavy air. "Leave my dad alone. He didn't steal anything." Another officer, Officer Barrett, who had been lingering by the security desk, moved in quickly. Without a word, he grabbed Caleb by the upper arm, pulling him away from Marcus. "Hey, let go of him," Marcus barked, starting to rise from the bench. Slade's hand shot out, shoving Marcus back down with unnecessary force. "Stay seated," he growled. Marcus's heart pounded not from fear but from the sheer injustice of it. He could see Caleb struggling, the boy's face contorting between fear and rage. He opened his mouth to speak again, to say anything to calm the situation, but he never got the chance. Without warning, Slade reached out, his hand clamped around the thin gold chain at Marcus's neck, the one thing Marcus had carried through years of hardship, grief, and pride, and with a vicious tug he ripped it clean away. The clasp snapped with a sharp metallic pop. Marcus jerked back instinctively, the suddenness of the motion knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, everything froze. The hallway around them blurred, the whispers, the gasps, the creaking shuffle of people recoiling. All of it muted under the roar of disbelief pounding in Marcus's ears. Slade dangled the chain from his fingers like a trophy, turning it slowly so it caught the overhead lights. "Looks stolen to me," he said loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. Marcus stared at him, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his body trembling with restrained fury. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't a mistake. It was humiliation. It was power, wielded like a weapon in broad daylight. Across the hall, Caleb twisted in Barrett's grip, his voice cracking with panic. Dad, say something. He can't do that." Marcus met his son's desperate gaze, and everything in him screamed to rise up to grab Slade by the wrist and reclaim what was his. But he didn't. Because deep down, Marcus knew one wrong move, one wrong word, and the system would paint him not as the victim, but as the problem. So he stayed seated, silent. Burning Slade smirked and pocketed the chain casually as if stuffing away a piece of trash, then gestured to Barrett. "Let's get him inside," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "We'll sort this out the proper way." Marcus rose slowly, squaring his shoulders, not because he was ready for what was coming, but because he refused to let them see him break. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not today, not ever. The sharp snap of the chain still hung in the air, vibrating like an unseen alarm that no one dared to silence. Marcus stood now, his chest heaving slightly with controlled breath, his hands loose at his sides in a practiced kind of stillness. The kind a black man learns young how to survive humiliation without giving anyone an excuse to make it worse. The hallway, once bustling with quiet movement, froze into a tableau of spectators. Staffers clutching folders, public defenders with blinking laptops. A few families seated on the hard benches, their heads swiveling toward the commotion. Everyone had seen it, everyone had heard it, and no one moved. Officer Dean Slade, oblivious or indifferent to the wave of silence he'd created, slid the broken gold chain casually into the front pocket of his uniform, like a man slipping loose change into his jeans. He turned toward the frozen hallway and declared loudly, "Confiscated evidence," as if those two words erased the violence, as if naming it something official made it clean. Marcus blinked slowly once, twice, forcing his breathing into long, steady pulls. His heart thundered against his ribs, but he kept his face unreadable, kept the anger buried where it couldn't hurt him. Not here, not now. Across the hall, Caleb stared wide-eyed, struggling in Officer Barrett's grip, too stunned to speak. He had never seen his father like this, never seen Marcus, the strongest man he knew, reduced by someone else's assumptions and arrogance. A woman in a Navy courthouse uniform, a clerk, maybe watched from behind the security desk, her hand half raised as if she wanted to say something, intervene. But when Slade's eyes flicked briefly in her direction, she dropped her gaze back to her computer screen, like a scolded child. An older attorney, papers tucked under his arm, stood rooted in place, mouth slightly open. He glanced once at Marcus, then at Slade, and then shuffled away toward the elevators, head down. The silence was not neutral. It was heavy, complicit. Marcus caught every glance, felt every pair of eyes, pretending not to see, every mouth pressed shut. It was a silence more brutal than any words could have been. He had seen this dance before, knew it by heart. People would pretend it hadn't happened, pretend they hadn't heard the chain snap or seen the cruelty on Slade's face. They would rationalize it in their heads, tell themselves there must have been a reason, some justification, because it was easier to believe that than to face the ugly truth sitting plainly in front of them. Slade turned back toward Marcus with a satisfied grunt. "Let's move," he said sharply. "We'll get this sorted." Marcus nodded once, so small it was almost imperceptible, and started walking toward the courtroom doors. Caleb tried to follow, but Officer Barrett yanked him back roughly. "He's with me," Marcus said, his voice firm but quiet. There was a pause, a dangerous second where Marcus thought Barrett might refuse, but finally the officer relented, shoving Caleb forward. The boy stumbled slightly, but Marcus caught him with one steady hand. "You okay?" Marcus whispered low enough that only Caleb could hear. The boy nodded, his face pale, his jaw set. Marcus placed a calming hand on his son's back, guiding him forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from pain, but from the weight of what had just happened. The knowledge that even here inside the supposed halls of justice, dignity could be stripped away without a second thought. Behind them, the hallway slowly exhaled. The whispers began. A low current of conversation, hushed and cautious, like people trying to convince themselves they'd seen something less than what it was. But no one stopped Slade. No one offered a hand. No one said, "This isn't right." And Marcus knew better than to expect it. He walked through the doors of the courtroom with his head high and his heart burning, not with shame, but with a quiet, smoldering fury. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a soft thud, sealing Marcus and Caleb inside the courtroom. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder as they approached the defendant's table. He could feel Caleb trembling slightly under his palm, but the boy held his chin up just like Marcus had taught him. Across the room, the dull murmur of lawyers shuffling papers and court clerks checking dockets filled the space with a brittle kind of noise, the kind that didn't hide the underlying tension, it amplified it. Marcus caught sight of Officer Slade leaning casually against the prosecution's desk, still wearing that crooked, self-satisfied smirk, the gold chain. His father's chain bulged obscenely against the pocket of Slade's uniform. Marcus's jaw tightened, but outwardly he remained composed. This wasn't the place to explode. Not yet. The bailiff, a wiry man with thinning gray hair, banged his gavel once. "All rise," he barked. The room stood as one, benches creaking and shoes scraping softly against the floor. The side door behind the bench swung open, and in walked Judge Naomi Holloway. Marcus's breath caught for just a fraction of a second. She moved with that effortless grace he knew so well. Black robes flowing, her expression carved from marble, unreadable to all but those who knew where to look. And Marcus knew. He saw it, the split-second flicker in her eyes as she registered the scene before her. She saw Marcus first, then Caleb standing stiff and small beside him, and then she saw the absence. The missing glint of gold that should have rested proudly against her husband's chest. It was gone. Marcus didn't move. He didn't even breathe as he watched her process it all in the span of a heartbeat. Naomi's face betrayed nothing. Not shock, not anger, not fear, just a slight tightening around the corners of her mouth, a barely perceptible narrowing of her gaze. If anyone else noticed, they would have thought it was just the typical sternness of a judge preparing to preside over a courtroom. But Marcus knew better. Inside her, a storm had already started to build. "Be seated," Judge Holloway said, her voice smooth and even, cutting across the room like a blade. The court sat. Marcus lowered himself into his seat slowly, careful to keep his breathing measured. Caleb slid into the chair beside him, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Naomi Judge Holloway shuffled her papers briefly, giving herself a moment, a shield of bureaucracy to compose whatever roiling emotions churned beneath her professional exterior. Marcus admired her strength even now. He knew how much that chain meant to her too. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the history of everything they had survived. Generations of struggle, sacrifice, resilience forged into something small enough to hang from a neck but heavy enough to carry the weight of a family's pride, and now it sat wadded up in the pocket of a man who didn't even know the first thing about dignity. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses and glanced over the docket. Case 4823B, she intoned, her voice steady. Holloway versus Emerson Realty Group. A simple civil matter. A property dispute. Nothing that should have ever required a police officer's attention. Certainly nothing that should have ended in violence. Marcus felt Slade's gaze on him, smirking, still utterly oblivious to the mistake he had made, the line he had crossed, because Slade didn't know. He didn't know the man. He had humiliated wasn't just another face in the hallway. He didn't know the judge sitting behind the bench wasn't just another official. He didn't know he had just tangled with the wrong family. And the fallout was coming. Soon. Naomi's eyes flickered once more over Marcus, and again her face gave nothing away. But Marcus could almost feel the tension radiating from her, a quiet electricity crackling just under the surface, the kind of energy that didn't come from anger alone. It came from resolve, and Slade, grinning like a man in control, had no idea he was already standing on a trapdoor and the floor was about to give way beneath him. The hearing began with the usual dry formalities. Attorneys shuffled papers, exchanged clipped greetings, and mumbled procedural jargon as the court reporter typed steadily in the background. But Marcus wasn't listening. Not really. He could feel Caleb stiff beside him, his son's hands curled into tight fists beneath the table, trembling with the effort to stay composed. Marcus reached out and gave Caleb's knee a subtle squeeze. "Steady, son. Steady. Across the room, Officer Dean Slade slouched near the prosecution table, oozing arrogance. He toyed with something in his hand, casually flipping it between his fingers as if bored by the proceedings. Marcus's stomach twisted. It wasn't just anything. It was the chain. His father's chain. Right there in plain sight. Slade let it dangle from one thick finger, the gold catching the fluorescent light in lazy arcs. He wasn't trying to hide it. He was flaunting it, like a prize. Marcus's breath hitched, but he caught it before it could become visible. He gripped the table edge instead, anchoring himself to the moment. From the bench, Judge Naomi Holloway's eyes flickered once, almost imperceptibly, catching the gleam of gold. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then very slowly, she closed the file in front of her, folded her hands neatly on top of it, and leaned forward slightly. "Officer Slade," she said, her voice smooth as glass but carrying an unmistakable weight, "am I to understand you are carrying personal property that was seized from one of the parties present in this courtroom?" Slade looked up lazily, still twirling the chain. He didn't catch the change in tone. He didn't feel the room shifting beneath him. "Just doing my job." "Your Honor," he said with a smirk. "Found this on him outside. Looked suspicious enough. Could be stolen goods for all we know." The words dropped into the courtroom like stones into deep water. Marcus said nothing. Caleb's fists tightened harder, but Naomi's face remained unreadable. Only those who knew her intimately could see it, the subtle straightening of her spine, the flicker of rage smoothed into something even sharper than anger, cold, deliberate control. "Officer Slade," Naomi said, "can you please explain under what authority you seized that item?" Slade shrugged, clearly unconcerned. "Standard security precaution," he said lazily. "No formal arrest, just holding on to it for evidence. You know how it is." Naomi's eyes sharpened into steel. "No," she said quietly. "I'm afraid I do not know how it is. Please cite for this court the statute or procedural guideline under which personal jewelry may be confiscated from an uncharged, unsearched civilian without probable cause or a filed report." The room went utterly still. You could hear the rustle of someone shifting in their seat at the far back row, the scrape of a pen dropping to the floor. Marcus kept his eyes down, but inside he felt it, the slow, deliberate turning of the tide. Slade's smirk faltered just for a second. He straightened up clearly, sensing now that the temperature had shifted, but it was too late. "Well, Slade fumbled. "It looked suspicious. I figured I was acting within reason." "Figured," Naomi repeated softly. "Acting within reason." Her voice was still mild, but her words were cutting deeper than any shout. "Tell me, officer," she continued, "was there a complaint of theft filed this morning that I have somehow missed a warrant for this gentleman's arrest? A report of contraband involving this courtroom?" Slade's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "No, ma'am," he finally muttered. Naomi leaned back in her chair, folding her arms lightly across her chest. "And yet you presumed the authority to seize a citizen's personal property without cause, without record, without chain of custody, and I presume without intending to log it." Slade's face flushed dark red. Marcus dared a glance sideways at Caleb. The boy's jaw was clenched so tight now he looked like he might snap his own teeth. Naomi saw it too. Her gaze swept to Marcus for just a fraction of a second. A silent message. Hold steady. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time since the chain had been ripped from his neck, Marcus allowed himself the smallest, quietest breath of hope. Because Officer Dean Slade, once so sure of himself, was now stumbling inside the one place he thought he owned, and he didn't even know yet he was standing on Naomi Holloway's battlefield. And here arrogance would not save him. The courtroom air had thickened dense with something heavier than mere tension. It was the weight of inevitability. Naomi Holloway adjusted her robe at the shoulders, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness. She let the silence stretch just a little longer, letting it settle into every corner of the room, forcing every person present to sit with it. Officer Dean Slade fidgeted where he stood near the prosecution's table, still clutching the gold chain awkwardly as if somehow it could shield him from what was coming. Naomi's voice when it came was low and piercing. "Officer Slade," she said, "you have admitted under oath that you seized personal property from a civilian without probable cause, without warrant, without formal complaint, and without following proper evidence protocols. Is that correct?" Slade shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He glanced nervously at the prosecutor, but no help came. No one would save him now. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered reluctantly. "Speak clearly," Naomi said sharply, the gavel of her authority slamming down, not with volume but precision. "Yes," Slade repeated louder this time. That's correct. The whisper that rippled through the gallery was barely audible but undeniable, like the first stirring of leaves before a storm. Naomi's eyes pinned Slade in place like a butterfly trapped under glass. And did you at any point inform this citizen that he was under investigation, arrest, or being detained in any official capacity? Slade's face flushed darkly. No, Your Honor, he said stiffly. Naomi leaned forward, lacing her fingers together atop the bench. Then by what authority, she asked softly, dangerously, did you determine it appropriate to lay hands on him, seize his belongings, and publicly accuse him? Slade opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. He had no answer, and the silence that followed was louder than any outcry. Naomi's gaze swept the courtroom. Every eye was on her now, every breath held slowly. Methodically, she turned back to Officer Slade. There's something else this courtroom should be aware of, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried with it the kind of force that cracks foundations. The man you assaulted, humiliated, and publicly accused without cause is my husband. The words slammed into the room like a lightning strike. Gasps erupted, sharp intakes of breath, shuffling feet whispered curses. Even the court reporter paused, hands frozen over the keyboard. Marcus sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Caleb's eyes widened, his small body trembling with a confusing storm of pride, anger, and awe. Slade's mouth dropped open in horror. You could see it happening in real time. The slow collapse of his certainty, the crumbling of the smug wall he'd built around himself. Judge Naomi Holloway stood, not in anger, but in utter, unshakable authority. You didn't know who he was, she said, voice still calm, but now laced with something sharper than fury, righteous, unwavering truth. But you knew what he looked like. You knew what you thought he was. You knew enough to believe you could treat him like nothing. The courtroom was a graveyard now. Every living soul frozen in place, the air thick with the weight of witnessing something irrevocable. Naomi's hand, steady and sure, gestured toward the chain still dangling limply from Slade's grasp. That chain, she said, her voice growing harder with every word, belonged to his father, a man who served this country, who died saving others. That chain carries more honor and sacrifice than you could ever hope to understand. Slade couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Naomi's gaze was cold fire. You disgraced yourself, your badge, in this court today, and you did it not out of duty but out of prejudice. The final word hung in the air like a guillotine. Marcus swallowed against the lump in his throat, feeling every eye now turned toward him, but this time not with suspicion, with shame. Shame that didn't belong to him. Shame that belonged to the system, to Slade, to all those who had watched and stayed silent. Naomi's gavel came down once sharp and final. This hearing is adjourned temporarily, she said. Security, please escort Officer Slade to a holding room pending formal review and internal investigation. The bailiff, a younger deputy who had stayed stone-faced until now, moved with swift, practiced steps. Slade didn't resist. He couldn't. He looked small now, shrunken, like the badge had been stripped from him already. The courtroom buzzed again, the sound of a reckoning breaking loose from behind long-locked doors, and standing at its center, unflinching, was Naomi Holloway. The sharp bang of Naomi Holloway's gavel still echoed in the courtroom when she spoke again, her voice crisp, deliberate. Officer Slade, she said, not as a request, but as an order, return the property immediately. Slade's hands fumbled clumsily in his pocket. The chain, that simple, precious gold chain, caught the light as he finally almost reluctantly pulled it out. His fingers hesitated. The arrogance of before drained from him, completely replaced now by something raw and rattled shame. A bailiff this time, one with a straight spine and a neutral face, stepped between them. Without another word, Slade handed the chain over. The bailiff turned and with surprising ceremony walked it back to Marcus, laying it carefully on the defense table as if returning a sacred relic. Marcus's hands hovered over it for a moment, trembling. Then he reached out and closed his fingers around it, a small act, but one that felt seismic. He slipped the chain back over his neck. It settled against his chest, like it had never left, as if reclaiming. Not just metal, but memory, dignity, and identity. Naomi's gaze didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened. To the record, she said, looking directly at the court reporter. This court recognizes that the seizure of personal property from Mr. Marcus Holloway occurred without lawful cause or procedure and constitutes a breach of both civil rights and judicial protocol. Murmurs rippled through the gallery again. There was no containing the energy now the tides had turned. Naomi's next words cut even deeper. Furthermore, she continued, standing now behind her bench. I am initiating formal misconduct charges against Officer Dean Slade, effective immediately. A low gasp broke from somewhere in the gallery. That wasn't just courtroom protocol. That wasn't waiting for an internal investigation. This was a sitting judge from the bench putting the full force of her authority into motion without delay. Slade, standing now near the back, visibly staggered at the words. Naomi turned to the bailiff. Remove Officer Slade from this courtroom. He is banned from court premises until the conclusion of the judicial inquiry. Yes, Your Honor. The bailiff said, his voice firm, professional. Slade didn't fight, couldn't. His badge might still be pinned to his chest, but it hung there like a stone. Now, not a shield. As the bailiff escorted him out, the entire room seemed to sit taller, not out of triumph, out of recognition that something rare had just occurred. Accountability wasn't whispered today. It was demanded in public in real time. Marcus sat back, his hand still resting protectively over his father's chain, and next to him, Caleb finally exhaled. The boy had stayed quiet through it all, tense, shaking, watching. But now, in the aftermath of it, he realized something profound. His father hadn't needed to scream. He hadn't needed to throw fists or rage against the injustice he had stood. He had endured. He had let the truth, their truth, do the heavy lifting. Caleb's chest swelled with something he didn't quite have a name for yet, something that tasted like pride but carried a deeper gravity. He understood now why his father always said, "Our strength isn't in how loud we shout. It's in how firmly we stay standing when they expect us to crumble." Across the room, Naomi sat down again, gathering herself without fanfare. The courtroom clerk shuffled papers nervously. The prosecutor scribbled notes, glancing wide-eyed at the now vacant spot where Slade had stood. And the gallery. The gallery sat utterly silent, bearing witness, not just to a hearing, but to a moment of undeniable shift. Justice hadn't just been spoken. It had been seen. And in the quiet aftermath, Caleb Holloway understood something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply refusing to bow your head. And today, his father, his family had shown the world how it was done. By the next morning, the courthouse incident had already spilled beyond the marble halls of Westbridge. News outlets picked it up first through social media, shaky videos posted by bystanders showing the moment Officer Dean Slade was escorted out of Judge Naomi Holloway's courtroom. The headlines followed soon after. Local judge confronts deputy over racial profiling, family heirloom sparks. Courtroom reckoning when justice gets personal. The Holloway case. At the breakfast table, Marcus scrolled through article after article on his phone. Each headline felt surreal. Each comment thread a battlefield. Some praised Naomi's poise, her control, her refusal to let the system swallow the truth. Others accused her of bias, of using her position for personal revenge. Marcus tossed the phone down gently and leaned back in his chair. Across from him, Naomi sipped her coffee, her eyes slightly distant. It wasn't anger that lingered between them. It was something heavier, older. The weight of knowing that even when you do everything right, even when you stay calm, stay standing, you're still forced to defend your own humanity. Caleb sat quietly at the end of the table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "They're talking about it like it's a scandal," he said, voice low. Naomi didn't look up. "They're uncomfortable. That's what happens when the truth doesn't fit the version of the world they want." Marcus exhaled slowly. "I kept thinking if I had reacted differently, if I had lost my temper even for a second." He trailed off. Naomi finally met his eyes. "You didn't," she said. "You held your ground, and you made it impossible for them to pretend they didn't see." Marcus nodded, but the bitterness was still there. "Funny," he muttered. "They see you when you mess up. They see you when you fall apart. But when you stand tall, when you endure, they squint, like they can't quite believe it." Naomi reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We don't endure to prove ourselves to them," she said quietly. "We endure because we are worth standing for. Always have been, always will be." A knock on the door interrupted them. Caleb hopped up and grabbed the mail from the porch. Among the usual bills and flyers, there were 3 handwritten letters. 2 were notes of support, short, earnest, from members of the community who said they were proud, who said they'd always suspected Officer Slade was a problem, who said thank you. The third was different. No return address, no greeting, just a single line scribbled in thick black ink. "You people ruin everything." Caleb's face tightened as he read it. Marcus took the note, calmly folding it without comment. They were used to it. Sad, but used to it. Later that afternoon, Caleb disappeared into his room for a while. When he re-emerged, he carried a spiral notebook clutched tightly to his chest. He sat down between Marcus and Naomi and opened it. At the top of the first page, written in careful block letters, were the words, "Invisible Heroes Project." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Caleb shrugged a little, but his eyes were serious. "School project," he said. "I want to write about people who don't get medals, who don't make the news unless something bad happens, people who stand up even when nobody's cheering for them." Marcus swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. "Sounds like a pretty good project," he said, voice rougher than he intended. Caleb looked at his parents, at his father's steady hands, at his mother's resolute gaze, and smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly who I'm going to start with." Outside, the sun dipped lower in the Westbridge sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Inside at the Holloway table, there was no triumph, no parade, just resilience and maybe, just maybe, the first sparks of something bigger beginning to glow. By the end of the week, the wheels of accountability had finally begun to turn. Officer Dean Slade sat stiffly under the cold fluorescent lights of the Westbridge Internal Affairs Division, a thick file of complaints open on the desk before him. For the first time in his long career, there were no colleagues shielding him, no captain smoothing things over, no union rep whispering strategy. There was only a long list of grievances. Racial profiling misconduct, excessive force that had once been quietly buried under bureaucracy, now laid bare for everyone to see. The inquiry wasn't over in a day. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, methodical, like erosion wearing down a rock. But the outcome became inevitable, pending the full investigation. Officer Slade was officially placed on unpaid suspension, stripped of his courthouse duties indefinitely. An internal review board was scheduled. Federal civil rights observers were invited to monitor. In Westbridge, that was something new. That was something different. Meanwhile, inside the familiar marble halls of the courthouse, Naomi Holloway wasn't finished either. At a city council meeting packed with restless energy, she stood calmly at the podium, a thick stack of proposed reforms in her hands. No anger in her voice, no bitterness, just purpose. "We will institute mandatory racial sensitivity and de-escalation training for all courthouse officers," Naomi announced. "Annual certification will be required. Failure to comply will result in suspension without pay." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some officers scowled, a few council members shifted uneasily, but the majority, the people who had seen enough, lived enough, nodded slowly. Naomi didn't flinch. She knew the difference between making noise and making change, and today she chose change. Afterward, she stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air, letting it fill her chest. For the first time in days, the courthouse no longer felt like enemy ground. It felt like reclaimed territory. At home that evening, Marcus Holloway sat at the kitchen table, a small worn-out velvet box open in front of him. Inside, resting carefully against the cloth, was the gold chain, his father's chain, the one Slade had torn away in a moment of arrogance. It had been repaired earlier that day by a quiet, kind jeweler in town who didn't ask questions, just nodded and said, "We'll make it right." The clasp had been fixed, the bent links replaced. The chain was stronger now, not quite new, not quite the same, but somehow better. Marcus lifted it from the box, feeling the subtle weight settle back into his palm. He could almost hear his father's voice, low, patient, full of that unbreakable warmth he carried through every fire, every rescue, every hardship. "Don't let them take from you who you are, son." Marcus fastened the chain around his neck. It lay against his chest like armor, not for protection, but for remembrance, for resilience. From the doorway, Naomi watched him quietly, Caleb at her side. "You fixed it," Caleb said softly. Marcus smiled, not looking up. "No," he murmured. "I strengthened it." Caleb stepped closer, awe flashing in his young eyes. "Just like you," he said. Marcus finally looked at him and smiled wider, deeper proud. Outside, the stars blinked to life in the darkening Westbridge sky. Another night, another chapter beginning. But inside the Holloway home, one truth hummed louder than the rest. Respect isn't requested. It's commanded by how you stand, especially when the world tries to make you kneel. And Marcus Holloway, son, father, husband, stood taller than ever. Sometimes the loudest victories aren't shouted from rooftops. Sometimes they happen in silence when someone refuses to bow, when dignity stands taller than arrogance, when justice finally looks the guilty in the eye. Marcus didn't raise his voice. Naomi didn't slam her gavel. Caleb didn't rush to anger. They stood. They endured. And in doing so, they changed everything, not just for themselves, but for everyone who watched and learned. Respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you embody even when the world tries to strip it away. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Drop a comment. Tell us what part hit you hardest. Subscribe and turn on the notifications, because we have more stories that reveal that reckon and that remind us why standing tall matters. This was more than a chain. This was a legacy reforged stronger than ever, and we're just getting started.